A lot at stake when the president flies to Alaska today. For more on that, we are joined by CBS News contributor and former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here. Very few Americans have sat across the table from Vladimir Putin. You have. Very few Americans worked for both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. You have negotiated on behalf of the White House.
And left on your own.
And left on your own. So there's no better person to talk to. What are you watching for in this meeting?
Well, first, I think it's going to be, it's really unpredictable at this point. I reminded of my former boss, Secretary Rumsfeld, used to talk about known unknowns. Putin is predictably unpredictable, and President Trump is just unpredictable. The things that could happen here, it's mostly a question of risk, I think, from the United States perspective. From Putin's perspective, he wins just by having the meeting. He's accepted back by the leading Western nation, the United States, after he started an aggressive war 3.5 years ago. He's back. He's negotiating with the President of the United States. For the President of the United States, for President Trump, he's got to guard against making concessions to Putin that are going to alienate our European allies and really do political damage to himself here in the United States.
Well, the president keeps saying that there will be very severe consequences if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire, but he doesn't say what those severe consequences are. So realistically, what leverage does the U.S. have here, do you think?
Well, the U.S. leverage has diminished over time because the administration has been saying things like that since the start of the year. We've heard administration officials saying in January or February, we're going to know soon if the Russians are serious about peace. And they were talking weeks. It's now been more than 6 months. And administration officials still are talking about, let's find out whether the Russians are serious about peace. I think Putin's answered that question.
Before I get to my question, follow up on Gayle, President Trump saying there will be very serious consequences. Is that an empty threat?
I think Putin, looking at what the record of the Trump administration so far, is probably making that assessment.
All right, so President Trump also talked about the idea of land swapping, other words, a territorial compromise. What do you make of there being some type of land swap at the end of this conflict, or in order to end this conflict?
Well, to end this conflict, the Ukrainians have to be included. They get a vote. They got a vote in February of 2022 when everyone in the Biden administration, from President Biden's ambassador in Moscow on down, thought that Zelensky didn't have a chance to survive. The Ukrainians fought back heroically. They're going to continue to resist Russian aggression. They're not going to give up territory willingly. The president and Putin might agree, but the Ukrainians have to be included.
How are they included if President Vladimir Zelensky isn't involved or present?
Well, that's because Putin won't meet with him. Putin doesn't want to give him that dignity. Putin doesn't want to acknowledge that he is an equal. Putin thinks that Trump, the president of the United States, that's his counterpart. He doesn't want to deal with someone whom Putin has been describing for years now as a drug-addicted Nazi. He wouldn't want to be seen meeting with him in public.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the fighting continues. Ambassador Sullivan, thank you
And
very
the
much.
death
Really
continues.
do appreciate it. And the death and
Yes.
the killing continues. CBS News is going to have complete coverage of this meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump today. We'll have it on CBS and streaming on CBS News 24/7, led by John Dickerson and Margaret Brennan.
And there'll be more on this conversation on CBS Mornings Plus, correct?
That's right, with the ambassador.
Looking forward to that.
President Trump is en route to Alaska for a historic and controversial meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin today in Anchorage. It's the 7th time these two leaders have met face-to-face, but the first time since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. President Trump says he does not believe this meeting will lead to an immediate ceasefire, but he also warned that there will be what he called serious consequences for Russia if it doesn't agree to stop this war. Ukrainian President Zelensky, meanwhile, not included in this summit. And President Trump says he hopes today's meeting will lead to another one when all three leaders will be in the room together. And by the way, one major sticking point in all of this is whether negotiations should happen, what should happen in the negotiations to the territory on your screen there in yellow that has been taken by Russia and used to belong to Ukraine, about 1/5 of Ukraine. That's land Zelensky says his country is in fact not willing to negotiate with, will not give up. A lot of money on the line as well. Since the war began 3.5 years ago, the U.S. has set aside close to $185 billion in aid for Ukraine. About $90 billion of that has been spent. So what happens now? What happens next? We're joined by the best person I can think of to talk about all of it, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan served as ambassador from 2020 to 2022, and then Deputy Secretary of State. But the key thing is you sat across the table from Vladimir Putin, and you negotiated on behalf of the U.S. for both the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration. So you've seen a lot. You've done a lot. What do you think of this meeting? Is it a good idea?
Look, the premise, peace in Ukraine, is laudable. Who would be opposed to that? No one wants to see the violence continue, but it can't be peace at any cost. And that's my fear, is the risk is that Putin is coming with an agenda, and his agenda is his imperial ambitions for Russia, correcting the great geopolitical catastrophe, as he describes it, of the 20th century, the demise of the Soviet Union. He wants to restore Russia to greatness, to make Russia great again.
So you don't put any credence in his claim that, look, this is NATO encroaching on Russia's borders and we have to push back NATO by pushing into Ukraine?
Well, I mean, accepting that argument is to say to the 100 million plus people in Eastern Europe who had been under the thumb of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact that they couldn't look west to protection from NATO from their neighbor to the east in Moscow, denying them their sovereign rights as Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians to decide what's right for their security and their future. The Russians don't, Moscow doesn't get to decide that for Ukraine. Ukrainians decide that.
So, Ambassador, we know that Putin doesn't want to give up the 20% of Ukraine that's currently under Russian control. Zelensky says that any conversation about giving up territory is a non-starter. So where can inroads be made in this conversation toward a ceasefire?
This war, well, there's the ceasefire and then there's a more permanent peace. The ceasefire is something that Putin could, I think, possibly agree to, but it would be a sham. He can't be trusted. He lied to the world in 2024, saying that Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine, had no plans to invade Ukraine. If he were to agree to a ceasefire, my speculation is he would use it to rearm, re-equip his forces, and then stage a provocation, accuse Ukraine of violating the ceasefire, and resume military operations. That's a quick fix that the Russians will never ultimately abide to. Permanent peace is a much more difficult issue for the very reasons you cite. The Ukrainians don't want to surrender their territory that the Russians seized by military means, and Putin, having lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight this war, he can't give up that territory now. That's a defeat for him, and a defeat that he probably wouldn't survive and stay as president of the Russian Federation.
So is there anywhere, I mean, where do you see the potential points for progress?
The points for the path toward progress has to include more pressure on Russia, which has been something that members of Congress, senators, others outside the administration have been urging the president to apply more pressure to Putin. Most of the pressure that the White House has applied has been to Zelensky, the victim. There needs to be more pressure on the aggressor. Sanctions, tariffs, as the president would say, to make it more costly for Putin, because at this point, he doesn't have the incentive to find a permanent solution to this. He wants to achieve victory. That's his goal.
So many of our viewers outside of the bubble of media and DC politics are thinking 3 years in, $185 billion. How long are we going to stick with this fight?
Well,
and why should we, I guess, really is the question.
One of the criticisms of the Biden administration, right, was that its policy was we were going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes without explaining why. Here's why. We have a permanent member of the UN Security Council with the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world that has engaged in an imperial aggression against a sovereign country in Europe. And Russia won't stop there. If Putin succeeds, we've already seen his designs on Moldova, Georgia. We've seen this happen before in the 20th century, right? Americans twice in the 20th century, in the Great War and then the Second World War, we thought we could stay aloof from a conflict in Europe when there was aggression, and particularly with the Second World War, an aggressive war of conquest waged on the continent of Europe with the principal focus in Central Europe. That's happening now in our lifetime, today. And if Putin's rewarded for this, what will it say to Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang? It's a much more dangerous world for the United States if Putin succeeds at this.
And for Americans. Ambassador John Sullivan, thank you so much.